Now I'm going to talk about this piece by Maria Lugones called Playfulness, World Traveling, and Loving Perception. So what's happening in this piece? Lugones is saying that women of color have to balance lives as outsiders to the dominant way of life, and that means white middle class life. And they live at home in their communities and families. So there's a sort of double consciousness where, for example, a woman of color goes to work in the white world but comes home to her family and community where she lives with many other people of color. She's calling this world traveling. It's a skill born out of necessity and because the white world is hostile to the other. So Lugones' ultimate claim is that all women should practice playful world traveling with a loving perception. This is to counteract the hostile environment and arrogant perception of dominant ways of life, which obscure differences as bad. So, what is arrogant perception? She's borrowing loving and arrogant perception from Marilyn Frye, which we read, but not this same piece. So, arrogant perception is the sense that the perceiver does not identify with the person being perceived. So, identify means that the perceiver doesn't think the perceived matters or doesn't think that she has anything in common with the perceiver. So, arrogant perception involves thinking of yourself at the center and others as at the periphery. So, think of the help for this. If you haven't seen the movie or read the book, the white women in it thought of their servants as just servants and not really as people with their own desires or feelings or beliefs or experiences outside of their work life with the white women. But not only white people and white men are arrogant perceivers, but this mode of perception was born out of a system of oppression that keeps white men at the center. So, loving perception involves identification with the perceived. So, even if I think on the surface I don't have anything in common with another person, I can still identify with her because I can try to understand her. So the point here is that the identification is sort of like putting yourself in someone else's shoes, but not keeping yourself at the center of that imagery, if that makes sense. So it's the opposite of what Huckabee said about Jenner when he was like, man, I wish I had been transgender in 7th grade or whatever. Because he was thinking of himself as a heterosexual man-identified male as being in the girls' locker room, not as a teenage trans person who actually identifies as a woman and struggles with that identity. See the difference between what Huckabee did when he put himself in another's shoes and what Lugones wants? So it's about taking yourself and your assumptions, beliefs, and background out of the picture for a minute and trying to understand that other person without the sort of tint of your own experiences. Another way of thinking about this is recognizing a person's subjectivity. This is what Lugones talks about when she considers her mother as a person and not just as her mother. So what's all this business with world traveling? I want to pick this apart for a minute. So a world is a social group. So it can be a society as a whole or it can be a smaller community. So for example, one world could be Okemos and another world is the south side of Lansing. There are also different worlds according to race and class and not just geographically. You probably already have some sense of different worlds where you're from. So take a minute to think of these different worlds that you may be familiar with. Now, traveling is when a person occupies a social position in more than one world. So many white folks don't have to do much traveling, especially if they're from affluent backgrounds, like Mike Huckabee. But Lugones says that most people who aren't at the center, so aren't white middle class, have to do some of this traveling. One common reason for this is because of one's job. So when you travel between worlds, the perception of who you are shifts. And oftentimes, like Lugones gives examples of, your own sense of yourself and who you are shifts alongside the perceptions of you. So why do some people not really have to travel across worlds? Well, because their own world is comfortable and because they don't have to. This is usually the case, like I said, with white people. So comfort involves many things: language, personal relationship with other people in that world, and shared historical experiences and understandings. But for those who have to, their identities are often doubled. Lugones says that she has a double image of herself and often plays on the assumptions made about her in certain worlds, especially in the white worlds that she occupies. In this way, she's a trickster and she's playful. So therefore, she has many identities which sometimes conflict with each other, but they're all still an important part of her. So then what's going on with playfulness? Playfulness is a sort of trickster attitude, but it isn't malicious and it isn't competitive. The playfulness she's thinking of is not related to any particular game, but it's a creative activity where people are actively participants and are constructing the play together. So this playfulness is important to world traveling because it allows us to construct and be creative with the worlds that we inhabit. So it's not an imperialist world traveling, but a playful, friendly, or loving world travel. So the point of all of this is that playful world travel and loving perception are important skills for feminists because, as Lugones says, we can understand what it is to be them and what it is to be ourselves in their eyes. So it's about coming together and meeting each other with our differences, with loving and understanding. This is the only way to reconstruct a social community that doesn't reconfigure the same harmful structures and hierarchies. And that's it for Lugones.